Our second lesson comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 5, starting at verse 1. Let us hear what the Spirit has for us to hear today. After this, there was a festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there was a pool called in Hebrew Bethzatha, which had 5 porticos. In these lay many invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been ill for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had been there a long time, Jesus said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am making my way, someone else steps down ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." At once the man was made well, and he took up his mat and began to walk. The word of the Lord. It has always been a special interest of mine to look at these healings and try and decipher some kind of pattern or repeatable action. In seminary, we would have constant arguments about what is that thing that needs to be in place for a healing to happen, because not everybody was healed. There were times when Jesus left the crowds and times when he would heal everyone or just a couple. So what was the difference? What needed to be there? One of my colleagues in seminary was insistent that it was a stature of humbleness, to which I answered with today's lesson and said, "This guy doesn't seem very humble." In fact, he gives a lot of excuses on why he can't be made well. He doesn't have anybody to help him. When he tries, he gets trampled on. It's kind of a snarky response to Jesus. Personally, I think Jesus deserved it because he asked a really snarky question. The guy is at the pool where people go to be healed. And Jesus says, "Would you like to be healed?" Yes. It's like asking me when I'm at an apple orchard, "Would you like some apple cider?" Yes, that is why I'm here. So I think maybe the man didn't have to be all that humble because Jesus didn't start off the conversation all that great. Usually what I hear as the thing that needs to be in place is faith. Now, this teaching is one I think it's important for us to examine and to test and to challenge, because this idea that having enough faith or the right faith equals healing causes a lot of harm. Because what happens when people aren't healed? What happens when we don't get the answer to the prayers that our faith have so fervently cried out for? I know people who have been straight to their face told that their parents died because they didn't have enough faith. It is important for us to examine why we say these things. And so that was the first thing I went to when I got this assignment to talk about Jesus as the healer, was to look at these healings and see, is faith truly present at every healing? And there are probably other rules out there that you might have been taught, and so I give you permission to take this week and do the same thing I did. Open up a scripture and say, let's read through some of these healings. Well, the woman who touches Jesus' cloak and is healed from bleeding, her faith is not assessed before she is healed. So faith is not needed for her healing, But maybe the act of reaching out and touching that cloak is a sign of faith, okay. But then you see the centurion asking Jesus to heal his servant. The servant doesn't have faith. It's the master that has faith. And so does that mean that anybody's faith for someone else is just as good as our own faith? Well, what about the 9 lepers that never came back? They didn't seem to have any gratefulness or want to praise or show their faith. And they were still healed, still as clean as the one who did come back and thank and praise Jesus. There is something in us that wants healing to make sense. When people talk about the story of Moses, which I was pointed out is on our third stained glass in, is Moses holding up the serpent. When people try to logic through this story, they say, well, when you get bitten by a snake, it's good to remain calm. It's also sometimes in some situations, if you get bitten on the leg, to keep it lower than your heart. So they're like, maybe by standing up and looking at this snake on the stick was some kind of ancient way of slowing down the venom. It's possible, but it's very hard to prove. Healing is so complicated because it's not just about our physical bodies, it's not just about our spiritual wholeness, it's not about just our mental health and our relationship health and our relationship with God's health. We want this to be repeatable. We want the magic to make sense, like true love's first kiss. We can depend on that solving the problem. As I looked through here, I realized Jesus has a pretty complicated relationship with healing as well. You know, he starts off his ministry doing these extravagant healings. Whole crowds are healed. People who have been sick their whole lives, who have been born blind, who have never walked a day in their life. These amazing, attention-grabbing healings. But quickly, the people turn that into a bit of a sideshow. And Jesus gets upset that they're missing the point, that they just want to see the trick again. And so he focuses a little bit more on teaching. We see him pull back from the healing. He tries to meet the people and hear their stories. But Jesus can't help himself. And he does do a couple healings here and there. This is when he starts telling people to not tell anyone. He heals people and says, but don't say anything, because I don't want people to remember this thing that got out of hand last time. I like to heal, but I don't want it to be a sideshow. I don't want it to be my whole gig. Well, the religious leaders kind of get a sense that Jesus is pulling back from these healings too. And so there's a moment where they test him and they bring someone with a hand that has been wrought over, and they say, it's the Sabbath, but are you going to heal this person? This sort of switches Jesus' plans with healing again, and he starts using healing to make a point. Yes, healing on the Sabbath is right and good. We should be caring for each other every day. He starts to get other people involved. He sends lepers off to the priests. He sends people out to go and pray. He sends the disciples out. He gets other people involved with this healing. Maybe it won't become a sideshow if I'm not the only one who is healing. As this healing expands, we see how complicated healing is. There are times when the disciples can't quite make it work, but Jesus can, and they're confused. Why didn't it work for us? There are other people who are using Jesus' name, and it's working for them. I did my best to try to find the true love's first kiss of how we get healing. I didn't find it. Maybe you will. Please go through, test what you have heard. But I think healing is complicated. And I think the how and why and when and who is complicated because Jesus doesn't want it to become the whole of our faith. If we don't get that one thing, what happens to our faith? There must be something more. Maybe we don't get physical healing, but we get a relationship that is healed. Maybe we don't get the financial healing that we have been praying for, but we get a blessing as from a child or a grandparent or something else that will make us whole in a different way. Healing is complicated. I wish I could have come here and told you what the answer is, but somehow it has to be enough to just know that Jesus is a healer. And there is a poem, my favorite poem, by Walter Wangerin Jr., called Ragman. And I think it perfectly sums up what kind of healer Jesus is. It's not about the miracles, it's not about the grand moments, it's not about this purpose or who. It's this. I'm going to read it to you, and then we can sit with it during the meditation song as we think about what is it in us that needs to be healed? What are we asking for healing that maybe isn't what Jesus' focus is for our lives? I saw a strange sight. I stumbled upon a story most strange, like nothing my life, my street smarts, my sly tongue had ever prepared me for. Hush, child, now, and I will tell it to you. Even before the dawn one Friday morning, I noticed a young man, handsome and strong, walking the alleys of our city. He was pulling an old cart filled with clothes both bright and new, and he was calling in a clear tenor voice, "Rags, new rags for old. I take your tired rags, rags." Now this is a wonder, I thought to myself, for this man stood 6'4", and his arms were like tree limbs, hard and muscular, and his eyes flashed with intelligence. Could he find no better job than this to be a ragman in the inner city? I followed him out of curiosity, and I wasn't disappointed. Soon the ragman saw a woman sitting on her back porch. She was sobbing into a handkerchief, sighing and shedding 1,000 tears. Her knees and elbows made a sad X, and her shoulders shook, her heart breaking. The ragman stopped his cart and quietly walked to the woman, stepped around the tin cans and dead toys and old Pampers. "Give me your rag," he said gently, "and I'll give you another." He slipped the handkerchief from her eyes, and she looked up at him, and he laid in her hands a handkerchief so beautiful and bright and new. She looked from the gift to the giver as he pulled his cart away. But then the ragman did a strange thing. He put the stained handkerchief up to his own face, and then he began to weep and sob as grievously as she had, his shoulders shaking, yet she was left without a tear. "This is a wonder," I breathed to myself, and I followed the sobbing ragman like a child who cannot turn from a mystery. Rags, rags, new rags for old. In a little while, when the sky showed gray behind the rooftops and I could see the shredded curtains behind blacked out windows, the ragman came upon a girl whose head was wrapped in a bandage, whose eyes were empty and blood soaked her bandages. A single line of blood ran down her cheek. Now the tall ragman looked upon this child, and he drew a lovely yellow bonnet from his cart. "Give me your rag, and I'll give you mine." The child could only gaze at him while he loosened the bandage, removed it, and tied it around his own head. The bonnet was set on hers, and I gasped at what I saw, for with the bandage went the wound. Against his brow ran dark, substantial blood of his own. "Rags, rags, I take old rags," cried the sobbing, bleeding, strong, intelligent ragman. The sun hurt both the sky, now my eyes. The ragman seemed more and more in a hurry. "Are you going to work?" he asked a man who leaned against a telephone pole. The man shook his head. The ragman pressed, "Do you have a job?" "Are you crazy?" the other one sneered. And as he pulled away from the pole, his right sleeve hung flat, the cuff stuffed into his pocket. He had no arm. "So," said the ragman, "give me your jacket and I'll give you mine." So quiet authority in his voice, the one-armed man took off his jacket. So did the ragman. And I trembled at what I saw. For the ragman's arm stayed in its sleeve, and when the other put it on, he had 2 good arms, thick as tree limbs, but the ragman had only 1. After that, he found a drunk lying unconscious beneath an army blanket, an old man, hunched and wizened and sick. He took the blanket, wrapped it around himself, and left for the drunk new clothes. And now I had to run to keep up with the ragman, though the weeping was uncontrollable and bleeding freely from the forehead, pulling his cart with one arm, stumbling for drunkenness, falling again and again, exhausted, old and sick, and yet he went with terrible speed. I wept to see the change in this man, and I hurt to see his sorrow. And yet I needed to see where he was going in such haste to know what drove him so. The little old ragman came to a landfill. He came to a garbage pit. I wanted to help, to be there for him like he had been there for others, but I stayed hidden. With tormented labor, he cleared a little space. He pillowed his head on a handkerchief and jacket, covered himself with an army blanket, and died. Oh, how I cried to witness that death. I slumped in an old junked car and wailed and mourned as one with no hope, because I had come to love the ragman. Every other face had faded, except for this. I cherished this man. I sobbed myself to sleep. I didn't know. How could I know that I had slept through Friday night and Saturday and its night too, and then Sunday morning I was awakened with a violence. Light, pure, hard, demanding, slammed against my sour face, and I blinked and I looked and I saw the first wonder of all. There was the ragman, folding the blanket most carefully, a scar upon his forehead, but alive. And besides that, healthy. There was no sign of sorrow or age, and all the rags that he had gathered shined for cleanliness. Then I lowered my head and trembled for all that I had seen, and myself walked up to the ragman. I told him my name with shame, for I was a sorry figure next to him. Then I took off my clothes in that place and said to him with a dear and yearning voice, "Dress me." He dressed me, my Lord. He put new rags on me, and I am a wonder beside him. The ragman, the Christ.